Welcome to another episode of Earth is Our Home with Dr. Thomas Blaine. We're going to be looking at the war in Ukraine, part 3, so stay tuned. Welcome to another episode of Earth is Our Home, in which Dr. Thomas Blaine, an associate professor with the Ohio State University Extension Program, examines the war, and this is part 3. In part 1, we looked at the history of Ukraine and its relationship with Russia. In the second video, we looked at the possibilities of disasters that could occur if this war continues with Ukraine and Russia. This episode, we're going to be looking at ways in which we can find some kind of resolution that keeps us from having any kind of major disasters. Tom, it's always a pleasure talking with you.
Well, it's a pleasure for me to do these videos.
The war in Ukraine, I think, really affects all of us. Wouldn't you say, Tom?
That's why I chose to do it, because this is not a conflict between two former members of the Soviet Union. This has a much broader scope than that. The whole world is getting involved, or much of it. And in any case, the consequences of this war have worldwide ramifications. And so that's why Earth is Our Home has an obligation to examine it.
Tom, you have had an extensive background in seeing the culture of Ukraine by visiting a number of different times.
I've spent a lot of time in Ukraine, and I've taught there. I have established a lot of friendships there. I've been throughout most of the country. I'm a Russian speaker. And yes, part of the complication of this is that much of Ukraine is Russian speaking. And so I am very familiar with Ukraine as a country and a culture and what it has in common with Russia.
And it's interesting, when you went through the history in part 1, you really showed how the two countries melded together and then sort of separated. Is that correct?
That's right. If we go back to part 1, and that's going to be down at the bottom of this video, links to part 1 and then to part 2. If you go back to part 1, you'll see that what is considered Russian culture, I mean, even the language and the religion, the Orthodox faith, was introduced into that area when Kiev, which is now the capital of Ukraine, was the capital of Russia. I mean, there was no distinction. It was called the Kievan Rus. The people there were the Kievan Rus. And I wanted to visit the former Soviet Union and get a Russian experience, but I didn't want to go to Russia because you see what kind of regime they have. I didn't trust it, but Ukraine is very friendly to the U.S. And yet in Ukraine, you see the foundations of Russian culture. You speak the language, you have the food, a lot of the clothing, the traditional clothing, a lot of the culture, everything has a Russian flavor to it. It's based on Russia. And in recent years, of course, Ukraine became a country, an independent country, around 91 when the Soviet Union broke up. And now modern Ukraine, its independent nation, seeks closer ties with the West. And that has not set too well with Russian leadership, specifically Vladimir Putin, and has contributed to this war.
I think history has shown that the Russian people, whether they're from Ukraine or from Russia, really have that sense of pride, that sense of values when it comes to their own homes and protecting their own homes, and that you can see the fierceness of each side when it comes to war. As we looked at in part two, that unless there is something that can happen quickly, eventually we're going to see a lot of problems.
Well, we're going to talk today about a potential solution, how this can be resolved peacefully. So I'd like to get started on that. Last time that was a pretty sobering episode. And I think there are some ways to get out of this without further destruction and death. So I want to talk about a little bit more hopeful message today. But again, I'm using Realpolitik. This isn't wishful thinking. These are actual ideas that could very well lead us out of this problem. I generally start these with photographs of me in Ukraine. Here I am at a war memorial in Eastern Ukraine. The first war they had was an invasion where the Russians invaded Ukraine in 2014. They took Crimea. There was fighting in southeastern Ukraine. It was a more limited conflict than this war by far. But I went to this war memorial in 2016, 2 years after that war. The heading on the memorial, there I am. If you look at those letters, that's in Cyrillic. The letters up at the top there. Chirias Roki, Chirias Viki. And that means through the years, through the ages. Through the years, through the ages. Chirias Roki, Chirias Viki. And it's got names and dates of the deaths of people from that area, Ukrainian defenders who gave their lives in that war. You see the wreath there. Now, the current war, we talked about it. It's much more than a regional conflict between two members of the former Soviet Union. We've talked about the relationship between Ukraine and Russia, but we extended the discussion by introducing global factors like Russia's unwillingness to allow its neighbors to develop close military ties with the United States. And we pointed out that it's not all that odd for a superpower to feel that way. In fact, Ukraine could not have fought this war without lots of military assistance from the far outside. NATO countries have been supplying Ukraine with enormous amounts of weapons. The United States has, and we just passed an aid package of $40 billion. That's an enormous package for the U.S. to be sending to Ukraine. And this is almost all military aid. I want to point out that most of this aid doesn't really go to Ukraine. It goes into the bank accounts of the defense contractors in the United States, who then send weapons to Ukraine, American-made weapons, rockets, bazookas, machine guns, artillery, tanks. $40 billion can buy you a lot of weaponry. And besides this $40 billion, there was another $100 million that went specially just for weapons. So this is a bit of a windfall for the U.S. military industrial complex. And when we look at U.S. motives, we can't rule that out because that's been a motive for the U.S. in expanding NATO, which has contributed to this war. Ukraine asked for more than this. They asked for the United States and NATO to establish a no-fly zone, but the U.S. wouldn't do it. And when asked why they wouldn't do it, President Biden just said, we don't want World War III. Meaning if we establish a no-fly zone, we're eventually going to shoot down a Russian plane. So we're going to be in a fighting war against Russia. And I guess somehow in this concept of Realpolitik, it's okay to send military resources to a country to kill soldiers on the other side. But if you do the killing yourself, you're in a hot war, and then look out, anything can happen. So we can, it's why it's called a proxy war. Ukrainian soldiers are killing Russian soldiers with American-made weapons. But as long as Americans aren't doing the killing, we're not in a fighting war. Well, but there are many ways for a proxy war to turn into a shooting war. And one we just talked about, when you start getting into a no-fly zone, of course. But there are other ways accidents can happen. And this is one reason why we really have to bring this war to an end. The longer it goes on, the greater the chance of catastrophe. Also, it doesn't appear that more fighting will lead to an end to the war. What good is it going to do to continue fighting this war? Neither side has the power to win it using the weapon systems they have. In fact, if it escalates, Russia could escalate, we talked last time, by using tactical nuclear weapons that could morph into strategic weapons, and then we're into an end of the world scenario. So we don't want that to happen, and that means we need to stop the fighting. And the only way to stop the fighting when nobody can win is through diplomacy. Now, diplomacy between Russia and Ukraine has failed. It's not going to work because, first of all, Russia and Ukraine are coming from two different power bases. Ukraine is a relatively weak country. How can they negotiate with the Russians? The Russians can give terms like, well, lay down your arms, let our army come in and occupy the capital. Well, what's the difference between that and defeat? There really isn't any. And so the notion of Russia and Ukraine failing in diplomacy is pretty straightforward. Since the war has a broader scope, and we saw the targeting of NATO capitals by Russian missiles last time, a diplomatic solution will require a broader scope. It can't be Russia and Ukraine. And in order to be effective, diplomacy of this kind really has to be among equals. Now, so we're talking about a proxy war between Russia and NATO. But who's the leader of NATO? The United States. And so we really need direct diplomacy between the USA and Russia. At the moment, this does not appear to be on the horizon at the moment, but moments change. Moments change. And this does appear to be the best way out of this. Now, this is not a pie in the sky. Diplomacy like this will be extremely painful because when you engage in diplomacy, you've got to be prepared to give something up. And that's not easy. The United States has been expanding NATO since the end of the Cold War. We talked last time about how this provoked Russia and how it really wasn't a necessary thing to do because NATO was established to serve as a bulwark against the Soviet Union, which ceased to exist 30 years ago. And Mikhail Gorbachev asked for the NATO countries to join an alliance with Russia. And we talked about how the United States and other NATO countries just wouldn't do that. But now, if we're going to negotiate seriously to end this war, we've got to give up on something. And that is, we've got to give up on NATO expansion. Currently, not only does Ukraine want in, where the fighting is, Finland wants in, Sweden wants in, all these countries. So you're talking about a NATO that expands right up to the doorstep of Russia. In other words, moving NATO all the way up to the doorstep of Russia. You can see how that's provocative. Putting military bases in there with rockets. The U.S. wouldn't stand for that. We wouldn't stand for a foreign military alliance to move up into Mexico or Canada. And so we've got to be willing to give up on NATO expansion. And that's going to be kind of like throwing Ukraine under the bus because they want in. Throwing Finland and Sweden under the bus saying you can't come in. You've got to be neutral. We want you to be neutral. And in exchange for that, Russia has to give up all of its territorial gains that they've made in Ukraine. They've got to get out. They've got to stop the war. They have to pledge that since these countries are now neutral, they will not see them as enemies and they will not attack. So each side's losing something. We wanted to have a NATO that could go right up to the doorstep of Russia. And a lot of these countries want to be like the United States. They want to emulate us, so they want to join NATO. And telling them, no, you can't join is not an easy thing to do. But for Russia, if you stop and think about it, for Putin to withdraw from Ukraine, he's got to have something he can take back to Russia and say, look what we gained. We gained something. We left Ukraine, but we gained something. He's got to have that because he can't be humiliated. And what he would have is this agreement, a treaty that NATO expansion has stopped. So instead of lose-lose, we could think of it as a win-win. Now, there is another way out. I do have to say this. The Putin regime is actually not all that stable. Putin, of course, is a dictator. He's an autocrat. Many of the people in Russia who are very knowledgeable, like the people in the government, realize that they've killed a lot of Ukrainian civilians and destroyed much of Ukraine. The attack, as far as Ukraine goes, militarily at least, was not provoked. They felt provoked by NATO, but still the killing of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, plus they've lost a lot of Russian soldiers. I don't know what the Russian soldier loss is, but they've lost generals even. Combatants that normally don't get killed. The generals are usually not on the front line, but they've lost generals. They've lost teenagers, conscripts into the army. And there are people in the Putin regime who have a conscience and don't want to see this continue. There's a lot of discontent within the regime, but everybody's afraid because they know Putin could have them imprisoned. He could have them murdered. The world's watching how we do this in any case. That's why this is Earth is Our Home, because I want you to understand there are two other situations where a nuclear power is looking at a non-nuclear neighbor, friendly to the U.S., and they're looking at that neighbor, that neighbor should be part of their own nation. China looks at Taiwan. Taiwan is like a Western democracy. It's a thriving place, very friendly to the United States. China believes Taiwan is part of China. And they make a good claim, just like Russia and Ukraine. China has nukes. They're building a blue water navy. It doesn't seem out of the question to me that one of these days China's going to deliver an ultimatum to Taiwan or invade. North Korea, a nuclear power, is looking at South Korea. North Korea under Kim Jong-un, they want to dominate the Korean peninsula. South Korea is a vibrant democracy, friendly to the West, high living standard. And they're right there. We have 30,000 troops stationed in South Korea to serve as a deterrent. But what's happening between Russia and Ukraine now could repeat. And if it repeats, these are two places where it will repeat. And so how we handle this crisis now is going to have a lot to do with what happens in the future in other places. So here I ended this before. There I am at the park in Nikolaev, Ukraine. And the sign says, "Давайте жить дружно." "Давайте жить дружно." And literally it says, "Let's live as friends." But I would, when you learn a language, you learn not to translate literally. On a sign like that in the United States, it would say, "Let's be friends. Let's be friends." But literally that says, "Let's live friendly. Let's live as friends."
I think what you're saying is very, very apropos. But let's take a look at a different scenario and see if I can make a point here. Suppose the state of California decided to align itself with Mexico. And it said, from now on, we only deal with Mexicans. So there's going to be no more commerce with anyone else. Well, you could imagine that in Washington, D.C., they would have a fit. So there has to be some kind of resolution. Now, suppose that instead we try to resolve this, Canada comes in and says, "Let me and the Washington deal with the situation. And then regardless of what happens, California will follow our rule." On the same token, let's look at Ukraine, which is a proud people, similar to the Russians, which are a proud people. They have not backed down from this war. And if we came along and said, "Okay, Ukraine, United States and Russia are going to solve the problem for you."
Read that. Ukraine could not have fought this war without lots of military assistance from the far outside. In other words, Ukraine wouldn't even be still intact had it not been for the aid. Yes, they're fighting bravely. I told you it would be painful. Did I say that the solution would be painful? Diplomacy is often painful. But check that out right there. Ukraine can't fight this war without us. We just sent $40 billion worth of military aid and another 100 million of strictly military aid. I mean, weapon systems that Ukraine is using to fight the war. Other countries have sent this. So it's not like Ukraine is freestanding on it. It's a proxy war. Think of it as a war between the United States and Russia. If that's the case, and it is, it's these two that have to negotiate. If Ukraine negotiates the things that they're going to ask for, Russia simply doesn't have to take them seriously. Russia will say, "Okay, lay down your arms and we're coming in." But they can't really say that to us because we have an endless flow of weapons that we can send to Ukraine to keep this fighting going. And yes, it's painful. I know a lot of Ukrainians. I think I said it's kind of like throwing them under the bus. But we have contributed to this The whole idea of expanding NATO in the 90s and 2000s was a really bad idea. Very bad idea. And, there's a good chance a lot of people who study this situation argue that the United States helped to create Putin, a nationalist who wants to fight to preserve Russia, that we would have had a better chance getting a real democracy in Russia that would cooperate with us had we not said, oh, we're extending this military alliance right up to your doorstep.
Well, I think the alliance, though, was really started 40 years ago, 50 years ago, because of the Iron Curtain and the fact that there was more of a distrust of communism versus commercialism.
That's correct. As I pointed out, NATO was created to defend the West against the Soviet Union. And if that's true, once the Soviet Union ceased to exist in around 91, why would you have NATO anymore? There was no Iron Curtain. There was no Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev said, let's have a military alliance together. And, the West wouldn't do it. That many people who study this argue that this drove Russia into dictatorship and into a hostile relationship with NATO, which should really have been dissolved.
Russia and Afghanistan, they were involved in a serious war for years. The United States was providing, it was another proxy war, I believe, where
Yes.
they were providing different things, etc.
First of all, you have to remember, again, that was not Russia versus Afghanistan. That was the Soviet Union
Oh, okay. All right.
against Afghanistan. Now, the Soviet Union was like a Russian empire, but it was founded, the uniting concept behind the Soviet Union was communism, Marxist-Leninist. That is not the unifying concept today behind Russia. They're not a communist country at all. They're a dictatorship. But what happened with the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, there were individuals in Afghanistan who wanted a communist regime. And so the Soviet leadership promised them, we'll help you with that. And it was just a minority of people who wanted that communist regime. The vast majority of people in Afghanistan did not want that. And so many of them were Muslims, basically believing Muslims who don't like communism, didn't want communism, and were willing to fight the Soviet Union's presence there. And since, they were willing to fight the Soviet Union, we were willing to help them. And so we did help them. We supplied them with a lot of intelligence and a lot of weapons to help fight the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union wasn't really trying to annex, Afghanistan. They were just trying to support a neighboring country and their move toward communism to be an ally. And they failed. After a very long time, they failed and withdrew. So it's a little bit different situation than what's going on in Ukraine.
Interesting conversation, interesting thoughts. I really appreciate the wealth of knowledge that you have about Ukraine and its culture. We're talking with Dr. Thomas Blaine. He's an associate professor at the Ohio State University Extension Program. Tom, thank you.
Thank you, Patrick.